probably watched a horror movie that said, "based on a true story," and thought, "Yeah, right, marketing trick." They all say that. Some of them are telling the truth. And some of those true stories are so much darker than the film that the movie almost feels like the safe version. I went through dozens of these. These are the 6 that kept me up. Let's start at the top. Compliance is a 2012 thriller directed by Craig Zobel. It stars Ann Dowd as Sandra, a fast food restaurant manager, and Dreama Walker as Becky, a young employee. When it premiered at Sundance, the audience response included walkouts, shouting matches during the Q&A, and genuine outrage from people who couldn't believe what they were watching was being presented as plausible. The film follows a single afternoon. Sandra receives a phone call from a man identifying himself as a police officer. He says one of her employees, Becky, stole money from a customer's bag. He says he can't send officers right now. He says Sandra will need to hold Becky in the back office and search her until he can get someone there. And Sandra says, okay. What unfolds over the next 90 minutes is one of the most uncomfortable films you will ever watch. No monster, no weapon, no threat of physical violence. Just a voice on a phone, methodically talking a series of ordinary people into doing increasingly terrible things to a young woman who has done nothing wrong. Audiences at Sundance were furious, not at the filmmaker, at the characters, at Sandra for obeying, at the other employees who got involved, at everyone who said yes when the obvious answer was no. Roger Ebert gave it 3 stars. His review posed the question the film is actually asking: what would you have done? The film received an 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. It was called gripping, disturbing, essential. A horror film with no horror elements beyond the most terrifying one of all. Ordinary people, ordinary circumstances, ordinary compliance. Here's what most people who watched Compliance didn't fully process. It's not a story the director made up. So, what actually happened? Between 1992 and 2004, a man made over 70 phone calls to fast food restaurants and grocery stores across 30 U.S. states. In every call, he posed as a police officer. In every call, he told the manager that a female employee was suspected of theft. And in every call, he talked that manager into conducting a strip search on the spot. 70 times, 30 states, over a decade. The calls worked for the same reason the film works. The caller sounded authoritative. He had an explanation for every question. He kept managers on the line, feeding instructions, maintaining control. And because he sounded like law enforcement, and because most people, when confronted by a voice of authority, will obey, they obeyed. Most incidents were disturbing but brief. Then came April 9th, 2004. Mount Washington, Kentucky. A McDonald's on a busy road. The manager on duty was a woman named Donna Summers. The caller identified himself as Officer Scott. He told her that one of her employees, an 18-year-old named Louise Ogborn, who had taken the job to help her family after her mother lost her income, had stolen from a customer's purse. Louise was brought into a small back office. She was told to remove her clothing. Her clothes were bagged and taken to Donna's car as instructed. She was given an apron to partially cover herself. She was told to wait. The caller then told Donna she needed to get back to running the restaurant. He told her to find a trusted male to come watch Louise until officers arrived. Donna called her fiancé, Walter Nix. Walter Nix spent the next hour in that back office with Louise while on the phone with a man he believed was a police officer. What he did to Louise Ogborn during that hour resulted in his conviction for sodomy and assault. He was sentenced to 5 years. A surveillance camera mounted in that back office recorded the entire thing, every minute of it. At one point during the ordeal, Nix called a friend and said, "I have done something terribly bad." He kept going. A different employee, Harold, was also brought in at one point to watch Louise. He lasted about 10 minutes before walking out and refusing to return, telling Donna this wasn't right, and he wanted no part of it. He was the only person in that building who said no. His name barely appears in any coverage of the case. Investigators tracked the calling cards used in the Mount Washington incident to surveillance footage at a Walmart in Panama City, Florida. The man in the footage was wearing a correctional officer's uniform. His name was David Richard Stewart, a 38-year-old prison guard and father of 5 from Florida. Stewart was arrested. He went to trial. In October 2006, he was acquitted. The prosecution had no recording of his voice. The surveillance footage was too grainy for a definitive identification. No direct evidence linked him beyond reasonable doubt. He walked out of court. His attorney said, "This is the best case they had. If they want to charge him again, bring it on." The calls stopped after Stewart's arrest. They have not resumed. Louise Ogborn received a $1.1 million settlement from McDonald's after suing the company for failing to protect her. McDonald's had been aware of similar incidents at other locations for at least 2 years before the Mount Washington call. They had received a memo from their own chief of security recommending action. They did nothing. Donna Summers received 1 year of probation for unlawful imprisonment. She was also fired. Walter Nix went to prison. David Stewart walked free. And here's the detail that makes this whole thing feel like it came from a psychology textbook rather than a crime report. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted his famous obedience experiments at Yale. He found that 65% of ordinary people would administer what they believed were potentially lethal electric shocks to a stranger, simply because someone in a lab coat told them to continue. The defense of almost every participant was the same. I was following instructions. I thought someone in authority knew better than me. I didn't feel like I had a choice. Donna Summers said something similar in her deposition. She believed she was helping. She believed Officer Scott knew what he was doing. She believed the situation was being handled by someone with the authority to handle it. She was wrong. And Louise Ogborn paid for it. Compliance premiered at Sundance in 2012. Audiences walked out because they couldn't believe people could be that obedient. But it happened 70 times, in 30 states, over 12 years, and the man most believed was responsible for it went home a free man. Netflix has a documentary called Don't Pick Up the Phone that covers the full scope of the scam across all 70-plus incidents if you want to go deeper. It's worth watching. It's also deeply uncomfortable to realize, by the end of it, that the question isn't really why Donna Summers said yes. The question is why almost everyone did. Veronica is a 2017 Spanish horror film directed by Paco Plaza, the same director behind the found footage horror series EREC. It hit Netflix and immediately went viral, with people across social media claiming it was the scariest film they had ever seen. Articles spread claiming it was so terrifying that viewers couldn't finish it. Whether that was accurate or marketing, it worked. Millions of people watched it. The film follows a 15-year-old girl in Madrid in 1991 who uses a Ouija board during a solar eclipse to contact the spirit of her deceased father. Something else comes through instead. What follows is a slow, suffocating descent into demonic possession that ends with the police arriving at a scene they cannot explain. The film closes with a title card. It says the events are based on a real case from Vallecas, Madrid. That part is true. And the real case is stranger than the film. So what actually happened? Early 1990. Madrid, Spain. A secondary school in the Vallecas neighborhood. An 18-year-old girl named Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro and 2 classmates bring a Ouija board to school. They want to contact the spirit of a friend's boyfriend who had recently been in a fatal motorcycle accident. During the session, a teacher, a nun, discovered them and interrupted the seance. She took the board and destroyed it. According to the girls who were present, in the moment the board was broken, smoke rose from the shattered glass planchette and appeared to enter Estefania's mouth. That detail cannot be verified. What happened next can. Within weeks, Estefania began deteriorating. Insomnia first, then hallucinations, then epileptic seizures that doctors could not explain. She described seeing faceless figures in dark cloaks that came to her at night and told her to come with them. She began scratching at walls. Her Behavior became increasingly erratic and frightening to her family. Priests were consulted, doctors were consulted, specialists were consulted. Nobody could find anything wrong with her physically. Almost 6 months after the Ouija session, Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro passed away in a Madrid hospital. She was 18. The cause of death listed on her certificate was cardiac arrest. Her family has maintained to this day that no adequate explanation was ever given. But here's where the Vallecas case becomes genuinely unique in the history of documented paranormal claims. After Estefania's passing, the disturbances in her family's apartment intensified. Her mother, Concepcion, reported hearing Estefania's screams from empty rooms. Objects moved, doors slammed without cause. The family's younger children woke with their wrists being struck against the wall by an invisible force. A disembodied male laugh was heard crossing through the walls. Glass shattered without explanation. 2 years after Estefania's passing, a photograph of her hanging in the living room caught fire. Not the frame, not the wall behind it, not the glass in front of it. Just the photograph itself, and specifically, just the portion depicting her face, burned. The frame and the glass were untouched. On November 27, 1992, the Gutierrez family called the police. Inspector Jose Pedro Negri and a team of officers arrived at the apartment on Calle Luis Marin. They found the family outside in the rain, terrified to go back inside. What the officers witnessed inside that apartment, and what Negri documented in his official report, has made the Vallecas case the most discussed paranormal police report in Spanish history. According to the report, the officers heard a loud sound emerge from an empty porch with no visible cause. A large armoire, which had been closed and latched, opened suddenly and violently in what Negri described as a totally unnatural way. A crucifix on the wall separated, the figure of Christ detaching from the cross by itself. A large brown stain appeared on the wall. Electrical appliances switched on and off without anyone touching them. The officers left the apartment in a hurry. Their report, which exists and has been scanned and published online by Spanish paranormal researchers, used the words paranormal activity to describe what they witnessed. It is the only police document in Spain's history to carry that categorization. Negri has given interviews over the years. He has never changed his account. He is not a man with a history of exaggeration or sensationalism. He was a chief inspector of the National Police. He wrote down what he saw. Shortly after the investigation, the Gutierrez family sold the apartment and moved away. The paranormal events stopped. The new owners of the apartment reported nothing unusual. Estefania's siblings, now adults, have said in interviews that some aspects of the story were exaggerated by their mother. Estefania's mother has maintained every detail. The police report remains unchanged. Paco Plaza has said clearly that his film Veronica is not a documentary retelling of the real case. He invented most of the narrative, including the specific demon, the siblings, and the ending. But the seed of it, a teenage girl who used a Ouija board at school, deteriorated and lost her life under unexplained circumstances, and whose family then experienced things that ended up in a police report categorized as paranormal, is real. Whether you believe in what Inspector Negri documented is your decision. The report exists. The words are in it. And Estefania Gutierrez Lazaro was 18 years old. Open Water is a 2003 survival horror film shot on a budget of $130,000 by a husband and wife team who funded it themselves. It follows an American couple who go scuba diving on vacation, surface after their dive, and find the boat has gone. They are alone in the open ocean with no land in sight and no idea if anyone has noticed they are missing. The film uses real, live sharks. Not CGI, not mechanical props. Real sharks swimming around the actors. The couple tread water, argue, cry, get stung by jellyfish, watch sharks circle below them, and slowly realize that nobody is coming back. It made $54 million worldwide. It traumatized an entire generation of people who had previously thought scuba diving sounded fun. It is based on a true story. And the true story is darker than the film in a way the film couldn't capture. Because the film has to invent an ending. The real story never had one. January 25th, 1998. Tom and Eileen Lonergan board a dive boat called Outer Edge in Port Douglas, Queensland, Australia. Tom is 33. Eileen is 28. They've just finished 2 years in the Peace Corps serving in the South Pacific and are on their way home. They've stopped in Australia to dive the Great Barrier Reef before heading back to the United States to start the next chapter of their lives. The boat carries 26 passengers out to St. Crispin's Reef, 25 miles offshore. Everyone enters the water. Everyone surfaces. The boat does a head count. The skipper, Jeffrey Nairn, counts 26 passengers. Everyone is accounted for. The boat returns to port. Tom and Eileen are still in the water. 2 passengers who had jumped off the bow briefly before the dive were counted twice. In the process of getting everyone back aboard, nobody noticed. Nobody checked again. It took 2 full days before anyone realized they were missing. When their bag, sitting exactly where they'd left it, was finally noticed on the boat. A massive search was launched. Air and sea. 3 days. The Coral Sea, 25 miles from shore. Nothing. In February 1998, a woman's wetsuit matching Eileen's size washed ashore. Barnacle growth confirmed it had been submerged since January. There were tears consistent with coral contact. No bite marks, no blood. 6 months later, a diver's slate was found floating in the ocean. Dive slates are small boards used to write messages underwater. This one had been written on. The writing, partially weathered, read, Monday, January 26, 1998, 8 a.m. To anyone who can help us, we have been abandoned on Agincourt Reef by MV Outer Edge, January 25, 1998, 3 p.m. Please help to rescue us before we die. Help! They were alive the morning after. They had survived 1 night in the open ocean. They knew help was not coming, and they wrote it down. Someone found that message 6 months later. Their bodies were never recovered. The skipper was charged with unlawful ending of life. He was acquitted. His company pled guilty to negligence and was fined. It folded shortly after. Queensland introduced mandatory independent headcount confirmations for all dive boats as a direct result. But here's the detail the film couldn't include, because the filmmakers only found out about it later. Investigators found the couple's personal diaries in their hotel room. Tom had written, "Like a student who has finished an exam, I feel that my life is complete and I am ready to die." Eileen had written about feeling too intertwined with her husband, about unhappiness, about distance between them. Theories multiplied. Suicide pact, murder-suicide, an elaborate stage disappearance. But their bank accounts were never touched. Their insurance policies were never claimed. A bookseller in Port Douglas claimed to have seen them 2 days after the dive. But this was never confirmed. Nobody knows what happened to Tom and Eileen Lonergan. What we know is this. They surfaced from a dive in the middle of the Coral Sea. The boat was gone. They spent at least 1 night in the water. They wrote a message asking for help. And then, somewhere between St. Crispin's Reef and wherever the current took them, they disappeared. The 2003 film Open Water ends with sharks. That may or may not be what happened. The filmmakers admitted they had no idea. Neither does anyone else. And that, more than any dramatized ending, is what makes it genuinely frightening. Because the movie ends, the real story just stops. Men Behind the Sun is a 1988 Hong Kong film directed by T.F. Mao. It was the first film in Hong Kong to receive an NC-17 equivalent rating. It has been banned in multiple countries. It caused such severe public outrage in Japan that the director received death threats. American horror critics have called it one of the most genuinely disturbing films ever committed to celluloid. The director's stated intention was not to make a horror movie. He wanted to make a document. Because what Men Behind the Sun depicts is not fiction. It is a dramatization of Unit 731, one of the most meticulously suppressed atrocities of the 20th century. and one that most people in the Western world still know almost nothing about. Unit 731. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. That name was deliberate. It sounded sanitary, administrative, boring. What it actually was: a covert biological and chemical warfare research facility operating in occupied Manchuria, China, during World War II. Run by the Imperial Japanese Army, staffed by physicians, using human prisoners as live test subjects. The facility's internal code word for each prisoner was Maruta, the Japanese word for logs. You don't process what's been done to a log. You record data and move on. The experiments were not crude, they were systematic. They were designed by trained medical professionals and carried out with laboratory precision. Prisoners were taken outside in freezing temperatures with their limbs exposed, doused with water until the limbs froze solid, so frostbite progression could be studied. Victims were sealed in pressure chambers and the pressure raised until their organs failed, and in some cases their intestines were forced out of their bodies. Prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and tuberculosis, and observed without treatment. Vivisection, surgical dissection of living patients, was performed without anesthetic so that organ behavior under normal conditions could be observed. Flamethrowers were tested on restrained human beings. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Korean civilians and prisoners were affected. Estimates of direct deaths from the experiments range from 3,000 to over 200,000. Men Behind the Sun attempts to document this. It is not an easy watch. Many sequences are almost unbearable. The director used real animal footage in some scenes, which itself caused controversy. It has been criticized as exploitation. It has been defended as essential historical testimony. Whatever you think of the film, here is the part of the real story that almost nobody knows. When the war ended in 1945, the architects of Unit 731 faced a choice. They could destroy the evidence, which they did, burning the facilities and ending the lives of surviving test subjects before retreating. Or they could leverage what they had. They chose to leverage it. General Shiro Ishii, the man who built Unit 731 from the ground up, made contact with American occupation forces. He had data, years of human experimentation data on biological warfare, on the human body under extreme conditions, on weapons development that had cost hundreds of thousands of lives to accumulate. General Douglas MacArthur struck a deal: full immunity from prosecution, for Ishii, for his staff, for the physicians who had designed and carried out everything documented in Men Behind the Sun. In exchange, exclusive American access to their research, while German physicians were brought before the Nuremberg trials, tried for conducting experiments on concentration camp prisoners, and in many cases executed. The physicians of Unit 731 went home. They returned to Japan. They got jobs at universities. They received promotions. Yoshimura Hisato, who ran the frostbite experiments, the ones where prisoners' limbs were frozen and peeled without sedative, became president of Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine. In 1978, Emperor Hirohito awarded him for what was officially described as pioneering work in environmental adaptation science. General Ishii himself was employed at Fort Detrick in Maryland, America's own biological weapons research facility, where he helped develop weapons that historians believe were subsequently used during the Korean War. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal heard exactly one reference to Japanese human experimentation on prisoners. Just one. The United States ensured it stayed that way. The Men Behind the Sun went home. They got jobs. They got awards. The prisoners, called logs, were cremated when the facility was destroyed. Men Behind the Sun tried to make sure those logs were not forgotten. Most of the world still doesn't know their names. The Girl Next Door is a 2007 horror film adapted from a novel by Jack Ketchum. Stephen King called it the first authentically shocking American film I've seen since Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer. Critics described it as nearly unwatchable. Many reviewers said they could not finish it. Many who finished it said they wished they hadn't. It is set in 1950s suburban America. A teenage girl is placed in the care of a neighbor. What happens to her in that neighbor's basement, with the participation of neighborhood children, is one of the most extreme depictions of cruelty in American horror cinema. When most people find out it's based on a true story, they assume the filmmakers exaggerated. They didn't. If anything, the film pulled its punches. Indianapolis, Indiana. Sylvia Likens was 16 years old. Her parents, Lester and Elizabeth, were carnival workers who traveled for work and couldn't always take their children. In July 1965, they made an arrangement with a neighbor on their street, a woman named Gertrude Banaszewski, to board Sylvia and her younger sister Jenny while they were away. Lester would pay $20 a week. He assured the girls he would be back in November to collect them. On the surface, the arrangement seemed manageable. Two of Gertrude's daughters, Paula and Stephanie, attended the same school as Sylvia and Jenny. The girls already knew each other. What Lester Likens did not know was that Gertrude Banaszewski was a 37-year-old woman in severe physical and mental deterioration, suffering from chronic illness, raising 7 children largely alone after a series of failed marriages, living in poverty, and operating on the edge of her own stability. The $20 payments came late sometimes. When they did, Gertrude took her frustration out on the girls. At first, both of them. Then, by mid-August, almost exclusively on Sylvia. What began as beatings escalated. Gertrude began involving her own children, then neighborhood teenagers, who she rewarded with beer and cigarettes for their participation. Sylvia was starved. She was burned with cigarettes. She was beaten with a paddle, a leather belt, a crowbar. She was subjected to humiliations that escalated week by week. She was eventually confined to the basement. One evening, Gertrude took a heated needle and began carving words into the skin of Sylvia's stomach. When she tired, she passed the needle to a neighborhood teenager named Richard Hobbs to finish. The words branded into Sylvia's skin said, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." Neighbors on the street heard screaming from the Banaszewski house on multiple occasions. One neighbor said the screams stopped around 3:30 a.m. on the morning of October 26, 1965. By 6:30 that evening, Sylvia was gone. When police arrived, they found 150 wounds on her body. Sores, burns, cuts, bruises, scald marks, eroded skin. The official cause of her passing was determined to be subdural hematoma and shock, complicated by severe malnutrition. She was 16 years old. Gertrude Banaszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. She was paroled in 1985 after serving less than 20 years. She moved to Iowa under a different name and passed away from lung cancer in 1990. Several of the neighborhood teenagers who participated received sentences of 2 to 21 years. Most served less. They were back in the community within 2 years. The house at 3850 East New York Street in Indianapolis became known locally as the Torture House. It was demolished in 2009. There are 2 film adaptations of this story. An American Crime, also from 2007, with Elliot Page as Sylvia and Catherine Keener, earning a Golden Globe nomination for playing Gertrude. And The Girl Next Door, the Ketchum adaptation, which is generally considered the more disturbing of the two, the one that made Stephen King say what he said. Sylvia's case directly led to Indiana's mandated reporter law, which requires every person in the state, regardless of age or profession, to report any suspicion of child abuse to law enforcement. That law was written because of what happened in that basement, because multiple adults on that street heard screaming for 3 months and decided it wasn't their business. Sylvia Likens loved the Beatles. She was saving money from babysitting jobs to buy things she wanted. She protected her younger sister Jenny with everything she had, even at the end. She was 16 years old, and everyone who could have helped her decided not to. Everyone knows A Nightmare on Elm Street. Everyone knows Freddy Krueger, the striped sweater, the razor glove, the idea of a monster who hunts you in your dreams, safe to face only while you're awake. lethal the moment you sleep. It is one of the most enduring horror concepts ever created. It launched a franchise that lasted decades. It made Wes Craven one of the defining directors of American horror. Almost nobody knows what Wes Craven was actually reading when he wrote it. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the Centers for Disease Control began receiving reports from the Hmong refugee community. The Hmong, people had fled Southeast Asia following the Vietnam War, settling primarily in California and other parts of the United States. They were young, they were healthy, they had no pre-existing conditions, they were dying in their sleep. Not from heart attacks, not from any identifiable physical cause. They were going to sleep and not waking up. The pattern was specific enough to be noticed and alarming enough to be investigated. The victims were predominantly young men, ranging from their late teens to mid-50s. Some of them had reported terrifying, recurring nightmares in the days and weeks before their passing. Nightmares so intense, so physically overwhelming, that they were afraid to sleep. Some of them refused to sleep. They drank coffee in large quantities. They took stimulants. They kept lights on and televisions running through the night. They stayed awake for days because they were convinced, and said so to family members, that if they fell asleep, they would not wake up. Some of them fell asleep from exhaustion eventually. They did not wake up. The Hmong community had a name for it. They called it the pressing spirit, Tsob Tsuam, a night demon that sat on the chests of sleeping men and ended their lives. Between 1977 and 1982, 117 cases were documented among Southeast Asian refugee communities in the United States alone. The Centers for Disease Control investigated extensively. They named the condition Sudden Unexplained Nocturnal Death Syndrome, SUNS. They conducted autopsies. They ran toxicology. They looked for inherited cardiac conditions. They examined environmental factors. They found no consistent physiological cause. Wes Craven read about this in a newspaper. He later confirmed in interviews that the reports of healthy young men so terrified of their own dreams that they fought sleep, and the ones who finally slept dying in those dreams, became the direct inspiration for Freddy Krueger and the entire concept behind A Nightmare on Elm Street. The best current medical hypothesis for SUNDS involves an inherited cardiac electrical abnormality, a channelopathy, that can cause fatal arrhythmia during certain sleep states, potentially triggered by extreme psychological stress. The clustering in refugee communities who had survived war, displacement, profound trauma, and the complete dismantling of their lives and culture may be connected to that stress. But that hypothesis doesn't fully explain the consistency of the nightmare reports, the terror that preceded the passing, the men who described the same pressing figure before they stopped waking up. SUNDS still occurs. It has been documented in other Southeast Asian populations and in communities beyond Southeast Asia. The CDC has not closed the book on it. So the next time you watch A Nightmare on Elm Street, the next time you watch Freddy Krueger stalk a teenager through their dreams, know that somewhere in California in 1981, a young Hmong man was lying awake at 3 a.m., refusing to close his eyes, convinced that if he did, something was waiting for him, and that he was right. Every film on this list said, based on a true story. Most of them were underselling it. The real phone call was worse than compliance. The real diary entries behind open water are darker than the film. The real immunity deal behind Men Behind the Sun is more disturbing than anything on screen. Sylvia Likens' autopsy listed 150 wounds, and somewhere in 1970s California, men were dying in their sleep from nightmares nobody could explain. The movies ended. The real stories mostly didn't. Drop the one that got to you most in the comments. And if this video did what it was supposed to, you already know what to do.